I went back and played Ryse Son of Rome and honestly came away pretty impressed. I thought this was going to be a video in which this was a title that I believe didn't deserve a remake or a continuation, but honestly, I think I would have loved to have seen more of this title, more of these characters, and kind of dive more into this universe. The issue is Crytek owns the IP, and I thought it was Microsoft, but because it's Crytek, we're more likely never going to see a remake or a remaster or any type of continuation, which is unfortunate because I think Ryse Son of Rome is a solid title. There are some issues with it, but honestly, I got it for $10 on Steam, and I felt like there was a lot of content here for me to enjoy. So let's talk about it. My first takeaway is that this is a solid revenge tale. It's clearly inspired by shows like Rome and movies like Gladiator, and I really feel like Marius as a character is far more in depth than I thought he was initially when I first played the game. I think there are moments, especially in his fight with the British barbarian Boudica, where you're kind of seeing a character in which trying to kill this person, trying to execute them on behalf of Rome, really conflicts with who he is as a person, because they have a conversation just after he defeats her where it seems like they understand that they should have been on the same side, but because of where they were born, because of where their loyalties lie, that could never happen, at least not in this life. And I really like his convictions overall. I have to say that one of my favorite things about the story is that it doesn't shy away from the brutality of the situations that Marius finds himself in. Most games, most shows at times will kind of cut away, but they don't do that here at all in Ryse. Like, you are going to see certain things and probably be stunned or shocked by them. And I really enjoyed the fact that the developers were willing to kind of put you front and center into that brutality, into that violence. So I commend them for that. I also really like the fact that Commodus is a massive piece of shit and he gets what he deserves. I feel like that character was created just so you can hate them, and I'm okay with that. Because when you finally get to fight him and you go through this pretty layered fight, it's really entertaining to watch him talk shit to you, be like, I can't let you kill me. I look like a god to these people. And then you end up getting to execute him in the most brutal fashion in front of his father. And I thought that was really cool and really well done. Next up, I want to highlight the set pieces in this game. I forgot that there were this many. It wasn't just the gladiator scene. There was the Wicker Man fight. There was the push through the Britannia Forest. There was the defense of York. There were so many things that were happening in this game that I was very surprised about. My favorite set piece, honestly though, is at the end of the game, Marius is grievously injured. He kind of lets Nero run away, and then he ends up getting attacked by all of these different soldiers, and you're just kind of going through these different QTEs to kill him. But I love the fact that you're killing them in really violent and vengeful ways. Like, Marius is tanking a lot of mortal wounds here, and he's just kind of brushing it off, headbutting dudes and then cutting their throats and then stabbing them in the back. There was one point where I was like, he's gonna let one of these guys live to tell the tale, which he didn't, which was entertaining. And then it all ends in this one super entertaining and brutal scene where he just kind of tackles Nero off this ledge, and Nero just hits that sword and just impales him pretty much, I want to say, from his sternum all the way to the bottom of his stomach, which was incredibly brutal. And somehow Marius survives long enough to interact with the Roman goddess Summer, which was blowing my mind. I just don't know how he survived that fall. That was like 100 feet. So to me, I really like the set piece diversity in this game, and I have to give it credit. Like, it was really entertaining because of just how cohesive it was. Moving on, let's talk about the combat. So I understand that there is a lot of repetitiveness to the combat, but here's the thing. When this game flows as intended, because you're meant to play this game in this flowing style, meaning you're mixing up your light attacks, your heavy attacks, your guard breaks, all that type of stuff. When you're mixing all that up, and then you're eventually getting to your finishers, and then you're hitting the correct combo for those finishers and a certain speed, it is entertaining. It really is. I really could not, for the life of me, get bored of just being able to flow through combat in certain sections. I couldn't get bored of ever seeing the finishers. they're just consistently fun because they're just so brutal. And the fact that what happens is that the camera angle changes based off of where you are. You're always getting like an entertaining angle of a kill, which is super fun. And yes, the parry system is very, very lenient, but that doesn't matter because it doesn't get in the way of the flow of combat. And I think that's very important here because basically if that flow of combat is interrupted at all, pretty much it kind of ruins the game itself. So that doesn't really show up though until you talk about the boss fights, which I will briefly in a second. But for the most part, I really enjoyed going to all these different sections, fighting a multitude of enemies, and it didn't matter who they were, and just beating the absolute shit out of them. You brutalize them in some of the worst ways, and some of the things I love doing is kind of breaking down a character to where that finisher icon appears over their head, and then fighting another character, getting that finisher above their head, and then having this double finisher, which is just super entertaining because Marius is a badass. Like, the way he moves throughout this game feels inhuman at times, even though clearly when you get to cutscenes and he shows off these different injuries, you're like, oh man, he got cut up, he's bruised, he's bleeding all over the place. But when he's in these fights, you are moving so much faster than some of the enemies you fight, and I just love the flow of it. I get that it's repetitive, but it can be really entertaining, and you kind of just shut your brain off at points in this game and just go with it. And that is the sign of a great gameplay loop, and something that helps you kind of realize that if you play this game as intended with that flow, it's perfect at times. Like, it really does hit the right sweet spots. I believe one of the reasons why I can hold Ryse in higher regard is because I'm getting the best possible product from it. And I think that's the case with a lot of the games I talk about when I mention, do they deserve a sequel or do they deserve a remake, is primarily because right now I'm getting the best version of that game. Essentially, I'm getting a game where a lot of the bugs were ironed out, a lot of the glitches were ironed out, and even though the game is repetitive and it's short and it's linear, I think what's here was really solid and really well done. Obviously, Crytek, made a game that was essentially a graphical showcase for the Xbox One, and I think that a lot of people probably saw the price point and went, there's no way. 5 to 6 hours, you have a multiplayer mode that's kind of tacked on, not as entertaining. There's not much here that can really grab you for a long period of time, but right now, at $10, that's the sweet spot. And I think the reason why I think this game deserves a remake, or at least a continuation, is because there's so much you can do in regards to the story, because there are these supernatural elements. You do talk about the Roman gods and goddesses, and I think that's something that you could explore in future sequels. I just think that when the game first came out and you started to kind of get into sort of the boss fights, which to me was like one of the parts where I just could not enjoy. So boss fights in this game are just no fun in comparison to fighting normal or elite enemies, primarily because you can't chain combos, and it's almost counter to the point of the flow of the combat that is really emphasized when you're playing through this game normally. When you get to boss fights like Boudica or whomever, and you're fighting these enemies, you really can only get like 1 to 2 hits in. That's really it. Like, even parrying or trying to stem off this massive combo, you just can't do it. Like, the game doesn't allow you to exploit that. So because you can't play the game as it's intended through these boss fights, they become a slog. And it really kind of showcases how repetitive the fights are. These fights can take 2 to 3 to 5 minutes, and all you're doing is pretty much tapping the same buttons, rolling off a certain direction. There's no real diversity there in the combat. So it is this massive flaw that I think that can be corrected in a remake or a continuation. I think that's one of those things that, we've had all these different advancements in combat systems here that you can pretty much kind of peek around and say, we should probably emphasize this more, have this free-flowing system, and then have it work itself out that way. Because when you're playing through these boss fights, man, they just sucked. That's probably the biggest flaw in this game. Like, you can take away the repetitive enemies. I wasn't expecting there to be a multitude of different enemies in the first place, but I think there was nice diversity there with the different classes, and I was okay with that. Like, certain enemies you had to fight a certain way. Obviously, the different on-rails moments, which were kind of weird, where you're just kind of shooting this unlimited number of arrows and blowing stuff up, but that was indicative of the era, and I was completely fine with that because I was entertained, just constantly shooting these war elephants, that type of stuff. But I really feel like this is the type of game that could really benefit from a facelift, especially when it comes to like its its own in-game action engines. Like, I really feel like the mechanics could be updated to kind of emphasize that flow again, and you can kind of make boss fights more entertaining. You can probably get rid of some of the QTE stuff. Like, there's a lot of it, but like I said, when the game flows, it's amazing. It's like this great feeling. I think the focus ability, which is pretty much the only real ability you have in the game, is completely broken. Just pointing that out there. I remember I was just like, I'm fighting these heavy enemies, focus, and just start slaughtering enemies left and right, breaking them down, that type of stuff. I think that you could probably emphasize new and different abilities, but that focus ability, every single time I could activate it, just did it in the middle of combat, kill 4 or 5 elite enemies, and then move on. I really liked the way that you could change up the type of health and experience and focus and stuff like that you could gain. I really like that system. I think that system is perfect because it really emphasizes aggressiveness. I think that's something you could keep because I think it was perfect as is. I really want to see a change in exploration. I really want to see that linear nature, but kind of open it up just a bit. Like, give us a little bit more to look around and kind of find different chests and make sure that it's entertaining for the players, because when you're going around exploring in this game and you're picking up certain small objects or finding certain vista points, it's like there's nothing too entertaining about that. I just couldn't find myself engaged enough. I just wanted to get into the combat. This game was at its best when you were engaged in combat and you were fighting large hordes of enemies. This is when Ryse was at its best. When you're just kind of randomly roaming and there's nothing going on and there's that small period of like 3 to 5 minutes where there's just no enemies around, it's just not entertaining. Because I think of these games like the earlier Devil May Cry games where it's like, if I'm not actively engaged in combat, I'm looking for enemies to fight. That's essentially what this was. So I really feel like with Ryse, if we can update the boss fights, kind of give a better balance in terms of the focus ability, open it up in terms of like the linear exploration, I think you could have a really, really big remake and a really good game. I really feel like if Crytek would just kind of open it up again, because they do own the IP, and just, you know, say, hey, let's talk with Microsoft, let's talk with Sony, let's get Ryse back out there, because this is a good IP. It's a good game. It was just unfortunate that, you know, at the time it was $60 and it was released on new console, new hardware generation, and it really had to make a big first impression. And visually it did. 100% visually, I think Ryse Son of Rome was worth the money. But when you started playing the game, you're like, ugh. There are some things that need to be fixed. And once again, I'm playing this game where it's pretty much at its best. So I'm playing the perfected version of it. And I really feel like this is the type of game that shouldn't be as criticized as it is. Like, I get it, man. There are a lot of short games out there. And I know that full price titles get a lot of shit. But this was a really, really good title. And I'm hoping that one day down the road, Crytek looks back and says, all right, cool. Let's kind of dive into our back catalog. Let's look at Ryse. And let's see if we can reinvent this IP, because I really feel like it would be nice to see this title again in the future. And that's going to do it for this video. If you like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.